Okay, hello and good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the CLA, I am delighted to welcome you to what I'm sure will be an informative event. My name is Ann Maidment, and I am the Director for the South West. Our webinar this morning will be concentrating on the business after Brexit. After a tumultuous few years and negotiations right up to the wire, a free trade agreement was agreed between the United Kingdom and the European Union, leaving many farmers and rural business owners breathing a sigh of relief, both in the UK and in the EU. But what next? I am pleased to introduce our speaker for today's event, Charles Trotman. Charles is a senior economist at the CLA and known to many of the members. Charles has guided us through many rural economic issues, not least of all COVID-19 over the past year. His work on Brexit has been extensive, and we look forward to hearing his insight into what this now means for the UK. The format for this event, as previously, is that your microphones and videos will remain turned off. Charles will present to us, followed by a discussion with myself, and after that I will pose questions from you to him. Please do feel free to ask questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will attempt to cover as many as possible. I should remind you that today's session is being recorded for future use, including availability to other members, and it will be available on our website afterwards to watch again. Thank you, and I will now hand over to Charles.
Thanks, Anne, for that, and good morning, everyone. I'm Charles Trotman, senior economist at CLA, as Anne has said. What we're going to do is take you through Brexit, take you through how the negotiations worked. So let's have a look at the general context. In June 2016, we had the referendum when we decided to come out of the EU. After 4.5 years later, on the 24th of December last year, we agreed what's called the Trade and Cooperation Agreement with the European Union, also known in official circles as TICA. Now, what this means is that Great Britain has now left the single market. It's also left the Common Customs Union. And it's important to remember, when we trade, we are Great Britain and we're not UK because of the unique position of Northern Ireland. And it's the very fact that we're no longer a member of the single market. It's important because it means that even with a deal, there will be substantial change in the way Great Britain trades in the future. So what does the deal really mean? Although it's 1,200 pages long, it's in fact a very simple framework that will need to be expanded over the next few years. Despite all the negotiations that took place, there simply wasn't enough time for a comprehensive framework, which will mean that the deal cannot be considered to be a free trade agreement. If we look at what a free trade agreement is, it means frictionless trade. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement does not. Although there may not be tariffs or quotas, there will still be barriers, environmental and welfare barriers, additional costs in terms of more documentation and transport issues, and of course, potential delays in the supply chain. This is why UK trade policy has to look at a more global presence, try to enter new markets. But the key point to make here is that all this will take time and it won't happen overnight. Now, if we look at what the new situation would mean for agriculture, and then we'll expand that into the wider rural economy. I think the first thing I want to stress is that trade is vitally important to producers because it actually dictates the prices the producer receives in the marketplace. And because there is likely to be substantial uncertainty, this will lead to disruption in the supply chain and to various trade flows. If we take the example of ports, due to a variety of reasons there, we already are experiencing major disruption in trade flows. It could be the case that those importing raw materials from the EU could see reduced supply, which could impact their production capacity and reduce output, which of course will hit the bottom line. And we'll look at ports in a little more detail later on. In the short term, it's inevitable there will be uncertainty in markets which will have a negative impact. We look at the medium term, the restructuring of the industry will see both winners and losers. So there needs to be an element of mitigation that built into business plans. And in the long term, businesses will need to be more robust. But where, as economists in the past, we saw the short term, say 12 months, the very fact that we've got COVID-19 here and now, that's extended that short term vision, so to speak, to 2 to 3 years. And what this will mean is that recovery itself will take longer. If we look at the rural economy, what would the changes mean for the wider rural economy? In the short term, as Great Britain is a net importer of goods, and a lot depends on the resilience of supply chains, it's likely to be both difficult and confusing for many. That's why the land-based sector and those businesses in the land-based sector need to look and think outside the box, particularly in terms of diversification and diversified opportunities. If we look at the medium term, trends for a number of sectors will go back to pre-COVID levels, but this will take longer. And it's come to a point that we now consider this to be a form of economic year zero, where everything's gone back to the starting point. In the long term, we recognize that there will be major restructuring of the sector, not just because of Brexit, but for a variety of other issues. And what we're saying is that in the next 5 years, we could see a reduction in the number of holdings by 15 to 20%, which could lead to greater economies of scale and should lead to greater efficiencies. But that will also mean there'll be greater opportunities to exploit diversification, not just in the tourism sector, which will give the wider rural economy a firmer base. Turning now to what might happen in the marketplace, even with a deal, we will need to find new export opportunities outside of the EU. EU markets are likely to become more competitive, and British traders may experience constraints on supply chains as a result of not being part of the single market. That's why the development of other product lines, the niche value-added products, will become increasingly important, particularly in the domestic market. There's little doubt that prices will become more unstable, certainly in the next year or so, as markets become accustomed to this new reality. But of course, if there are shortages in supply, it will lead to higher prices in certain commodities. And that's why it's very important to keep an eye on market developments. But landowners also need to look at other areas, environmental markets, for example, and keep certainly a close eye on the development of elms. And of course, some may wish to take up the offer that the Secretary of State, George Eustice, made a couple of months ago, switch production in order to take advantage. However, as we know, it's not quite as simple as that. And planning needs to go into how a business can diversify, not just in agriculture, but beyond agriculture, into the wider rural economy. So as with risks, there will also be opportunities, but what are these opportunities? For businesses to be able to exploit them, there needs to be clear planning to make the best of those opportunities. And here are some to consider. Local markets. COVID-19 has shown the growth of interest in local markets from consumers. And for a number of businesses affected directly by COVID-19, it's been a lifeline. And it's going to be important to build on those developments. One of the biggest problems that we've had, and one of the major problems I've been struggling with since I've been at CLA since 2002, has been the lack of digital connectivity, but we are getting there. But businesses need the skills in order to be able to fully utilize the technology that can and will make a difference. Again, we're pushing government at every opportunity that we get. We look at collaboration and the need to collaborate. These have been perennials, but in today's and tomorrow's market, this will be essential. Rather than talking about it, businesses actually need to start doing it. And with any effective and resilient business, it's important to take hold of the opportunities that arise, as well as those that are engineered. It's vital to think laterally and outside the box, in a sense, to begin to think outside of that business comfort zone. We've had challenges, we've had vulnerabilities in the rural economy exposed by COVID-19. And next come two more that will just will have just as big as an impact: the effect of Brexit and the changes to agricultural policy. Others have called this the perfect storm, but I've termed it the triple whammy, when these three events come together and shape agriculture, rural economies, and rural societies for years to come. What this will point to is a period of substantial change, where undoubtedly there will be these significant challenges, ranging from the need for greater efficiencies, expanding portfolios through diversification, and getting the business in the best possible shape. But I would suggest that now is the time to embrace the challenges that we have through proper business planning and making sure that the business is remote, or rather is as robust as possible. Robustness and resilience are going to be key as we move forward. So what I'm going to do now is take you through the effect of Brexit, the effect of the changes to the trading system, and also the impacts in certain sectors. So if we look at the ports and supply chain, there are now real concerns at ports across the country, but particularly in the east and the southeast, so Felixstowe, Harwich, Dover and Southampton, that the necessary infrastructure is simply not in place. We've already seen the effects of COVID-19 on ports and stockpiling that has taken place as businesses seek to get a head start in trade. And unfortunately, we can't see this getting any better, certainly in the next 2 months. And there will be confusion and uncertainty that will disrupt trade flows. The impact is immediate, but at the moment, because the volume of trade from this country to mainland Europe is reduced, these issues are manageable, and that trade has reduced to around 30% since the start of the year. But as the volumes and that trade begins to increase, problems will emerge, particularly over EU customs and the paperwork involved. We now know that consignments are being delayed at Calais for a number of reasons, all related to increased administration, from not having a signed export health certificate to failing to pre-notify EU customs authorities. What this does, it delays the supply chain and increases the costs of traders. And reinforcing the point I made earlier, these increased costs could find their way to lower prices for producers. That's why it's absolutely vital that we get the system working as quickly as possible and as effectively as possible. But where the UK was once seen as the gateway to Europe, that's certainly no longer going to be the case. And European trade will inevitably falter unless problems over infrastructure, which we're seeing now, resources such as the lack of customs officials, and capacity at ports are resolved quickly. If we look at export health certificates, I think the first point to make is that if you export to the EU, you need what's called an Economic Operator Registration Identification Number, or what we call an EORI number. Any product of animal origin must be accompanied by an assigned export health certificate. Now, the EHCs are signed by an approved certifier, who in the main will tend to be an official vet, and the lists are available of those vets who can sign EHCs on the government website. But the point to make here is that EHCs will only be signed after the consignment has actually been inspected. The process at the moment that official vets are going through is tending to certainly delay the process of getting goods out to ports, because official vets are being very stringent in complying with the regulations, which of course they need to. Another issue that is coming to the fore is that of what's called pre-notification. For any movement of animal products from Great Britain to the EU, the importer, that is the person bringing the goods into the EU, has to pre-notify the EU customs authorities. And we've already seen over the last 10, 11 days since we formally left the single market, there have been a number of cases where goods have been delayed at border customs posts because of no pre-notification. So it's important to make sure that those who trade, they go through the right process in order to avoid delay, because if you can avoid delay, you reduce costs. Turning to phytosanitary certificates, if you import regulated plants and plant products, you need a phytosanitary certificate. This ensures that the goods have been inspected, comply with UK law, and are free of pests and diseases. It's the responsibility of the importer to also pre-notify with the what's called the UK's Procedure for Electronic Application for Certificates, or PEACH, as well as ensuring that the correct documentation is attached with each consignment. Now, regulated plants include all plants for planting, some cut flowers, seeds and grains, potatoes from some countries, and machinery or vehicles which have been operated for agricultural or forestry purposes. It's also important to remember that the UK's import controls are set within what's called the border operating model, and these controls will be actually increased over a period of time, and we'll go through what is the border operating model now. The model regulates the flow of all imports into Great Britain from the EU and other countries. It started on the 1st of January 2021, but in order to introduce greater flexibility, there will be 3 phases. From the 1st of January to the 31st of March, that's phase 1. From the 1st of April to the 30th of June, phase 2, and onwards from the 1st of July. So to give you an idea how the model will actually work in practice, let's look at the import of animal products. So if we look at stage 1 from the 1st of January 2021, live animals, including horses, equines, will be subject to new import controls, and goods must be accompanied by a health certificate and pre-notified by the importer using what's called IPAFS. Now, IPAFS is the Great Britain system for controlling livestock imports. Its full name is the Import of Animals, Food and Feed System. The Animal and Plant Health Authority continues to carry out identity and physical checks on EU imports of live animals based on assessments of biosecurity and public health risks until July 2021. So essentially what they're doing is they're putting in place a system of risk assessments. Stage 2 begins on the 1st of April, running through to the 30th of June. And imports of products of animal origin must be accompanied by a health certificate, and these will be checked remotely. And again, they must be pre-notified using the IPAFS system. And stage 3, the final stage, from the 1st of July 2021, all products of animal origin and certain animal byproducts, which are not considered to be high risk, can only enter Great Britain at an established point of entry at an appropriate border control post. So what you can see is that Great Britain will slowly but steadily increase the controls it uses to regulate imports coming into the country. It is a complex system, but it will become easier. If we look at one of the more complex issues, rules of origin. And as I say in the final bullet point here, rules of origin are incredibly complex, but it is important to understand some of the basics as these underpin trade with the EU, and they actually relate to whether tariffs are applied on products which are re-exported from Great Britain to the European Union. The key here is that in order for a manufacturer, a processor, a trader to comply with rules of origin and not be faced with a tariff on the product when re-exported, it has to have undergone a transformation. That is, it must be processed. There are different methods as to how processing can take place in order to comply with rules of origin. One is there is a certain percentage that is given to each product which comes into Great Britain from a third country, so say from the United States or from Australia, that can be used, but that product, or that ingredient, has to be used in the processing process itself. If a finished good, however, comes into Great Britain, let's say from the United States, and is then re-exported from Great Britain to the EU, it will face a tariff. Now, the complexity of the system is such that rules of origin and their understanding is one of the greatest single issues facing the agri-food sector at the moment. And believe me, there are countless meetings taking place to try and resolve and clarify what the situation is. If we look at labour, what the effect of labour will be, we've already seen what the effect can be with a shortage of labour during COVID-19. Last year, out of 75,000 migrant workers in the various sectors that were employed in agriculture, only 19,000 were available. And we know that this affected every single agricultural sector, be it fruit and vegetables, arable, dairy, right the way through to the processing sector. Last year, we managed to get away with it. This year, rather, that will not be the case. And I think it's important to remember that this is a political decision. It's clearly not based on sound economics, as labour shortages do untold damage to both output and margin. Now, the government has decided to extend the seasonal workers scheme in agriculture to 30,000 migrant workers, which obviously we welcome, but it's only for 1 year. And in our view, it needs to be at least doubled. And it's inevitable that the shortage of labour will have major repercussions for businesses, and planning forward is needed now in order to mitigate the problems which no doubt will exist in the future. Now, I've already mentioned IPAFs, I've already mentioned what are called EORIs and PEACH, along with export health certificates, phytosanitary certificates and pre-notification. What I haven't mentioned is what's called T1 and T2 status. That's to do with vehicle movements, nor what are called ECMT permits, which are required to ship goods to the EU. That's for another day, but what it does, it illustrates the sheer complexity that is involved, the additional paperwork, as well as the additional resource that will be needed in order to trade with the EU in the future. So what's important is that those in the sector understand the need to register for the new systems and ensure that they are well aware of the documentation which is being required in order to prevent delays taking place in the supply chain, whether we're talking about exports of GB goods to the EU or imports coming into Great Britain itself. So let's have a look at the impact. Let's begin with fruit and vegetables. Obviously, when trading systems change as fundamentally as the present one has, there will be shocks. Absolutely no doubt about that. If we look at fruit and vegetables, we anticipate the supply costs will increase. This could be the result of higher costs in the EU to mitigate supply chain issues, such as shipping costs, a weakening of sterling, meaning import costs will increase, and other costs generally associated with disruption, such as higher costs throughout the supply chain. There's also the issue of increased documentation, particularly in terms of customs declarations, VAT reclaims, and duty deferment. All these will change and are in the process of being changed. But we also need to recognise that Great Britain is a net importer of fruit and vegetables. So it's important to keep the trade flows going and keeping disruption to an absolute minimum. But the problem here is that when you bring together these shocks to the system, they produce a major destabilizing effect, which business must be able to cater for. There's also an issue of who picks up these additional costs. Is it the exporter, the importer, the consumer, or ultimately the producer? All of us are aware of the situation with the main retailers. We all understand their concern is to ensure market share and footfall. In order to do this, they rely on cheap food, which means that producers' margins tend to be squeezed. We've had these problems for a number of years despite the grocery code, but it's very possible that producers will begin to experience added costs being put onto supplier contracts, which will further reduce the producer price. Let's turn to Arable. And when we compare the changes that will affect the arable sector over the next few months and years to those in the livestock sector, it doesn't appear to be that much to worry about. Yes, there's the potential of tariffs and shipments, and of course rules of origin, but the documentation requirements appear to be less cumbersome. Unfortunately, the actual reality is the opposite of that. Arable businesses, growers, merchants, exporters, importers, and the like will now have to understand how the trade rules affect high-risk products, what can and cannot be exported to the EU, changes to plant passports, the three-stage import process through what we've gone through, the border operating model, phytosanitary certificates, the list goes on. It's complex and it's challenging, but understanding the rules is absolutely necessary, because what happens in the markets across the world through the trading system will affect the price you receive for what you produce. We still, as I said, we still have problems with the interpretation of rules of origin. Will there be clarity? We're seeking that at the moment. And what it means is that these levels of uncertainty are still there. The levels of uncertainty we had before we got the deal are still there now. And it will take some time for the system to adjust, for the system to evolve. And when you trade, a day can make an awful lot of difference if something goes wrong. And the third bullet point there, will we be able to see grain traded across global markets? Will it be delayed in transit via the EU? Also known as the Genoa riddle, because of customs controls at the port of Genoa, which tends to lead to major delays in the supply chain. All these questions still have to be answered. And as I said, it could be some time before we get the answers. Now, that's why it's important for business now to recognize and understand the changes, because ultimately they affect the bottom line for that business. So that's arable. Let's look at livestock. As with arable, new systems are complex, and it's going to be a case of going through the process of ensuring that the right documentation is in place and procedures as they're set out are followed. But again, from an economic point of view, what the new system could do is increase downward pressure on prices that are received. There's the potential that raw material costs for producers will increase, leading to a squeeze on the producer price, which means it's important that livestock producers introduce greater efficiencies in order to mitigate price pressures, and that traders look to other markets, not just to those in the EU, given the fact that that has been our largest market. Now, a lot was made during the negotiations about the regulatory framework. This is, in a sense, the level playing field. And one of the reasons that we were given for leaving the EU was that as a sovereign nation, we could introduce our own regulations, we could introduce our own regulatory system without the bureaucracy of Brussels. The trade and cooperation agreement and the level playing field means that certainly in the short and medium term, however, that isn't the case. And although the UK's government's aim was to allow for divergence from EU rules, this ran so contrary to the EU's negotiating mandate that a compromise was struck. And there would be a period of reflection. For some, that, it's unfortunate that that period of reflection will be at least 5 years before anyone, whether they be in the EU or in the UK government, contemplates regulatory divergence. In short, it means that the present regulatory system and the associated barriers that we have, particularly in terms of SPS measures, will be here to stay. Now, if we look quickly at the wider rural business economy and what the impacts will be, again, we'll see that pressure will begin to build, and the challenges and vulnerabilities that I've already identified will need to be addressed. But in order for that to happen, it needs the full support of the government, both directly and indirectly. And businesses need to understand the changes that take place. They need to make the businesses as resilient as possible. And that's where contingency planning comes into effect. Business plan must be flexible and adaptable. But again, all this will take time and certainly no easy fix. And the next 12 months will be crucial for rural businesses. And it's going to be important that we actually can manage that uncertainty and that evolution, because there will be major restructuring in a number of key sectors over the next year, over the next 12 months, two to 3 years to come. So let's just summarize very quickly. We know from January 2021, from January this year, there will be substantial change. We're already seeing it. We know that the trading relationship with the EU will introduce further challenges. The deal itself is a very simple framework. It will need to be expanded. It will need to be worked on, and that will take time. There may not be quotas or tariffs, but there will be, and there still are barriers. And it's going to be vitally important that the UK expands into other markets. We need to be able to make businesses as adaptable as possible. And it's important that businesses look out for new opportunities, however unusual they may be. It's also going to be important that you as a business owner, as a landowner, you are kept up to date with as much information as possible. And we strongly advise that you contact your CLA region for the latest advice, as well as go onto the CLA Brexit Hub. The website address is there, and all the information that you're going to need now and in the future will be made available on the hub. So that's the end of the presentation. I'm going to hand back now to Anne, who I think is going to start the questions and see how far we can get.
Absolutely, brilliant. Thank you, Charles. A lot to get through there. So we've had a couple of questions come in, but I'd like to have a discussion. I'm going to include some questions from the members as we go. So to start off with, now that the UK and the EU have secured a trade deal, irrespective of how short and shallow it may be, surely that's the end of Brexit.
No, it won't be. Everybody was hoping it's going to be the end of Brexit, but I think we've got to realise that the Trading Cooperation Agreement is the start of another process. It's essentially, we're extending the principle of the implementation plan. We need to understand how trade will actually work in the future. There will be difficulties. Although the agreement is 1,200 pages long, most trade agreements are at least 4,000 to 5,000 pages long, because they have to include goods and services. So we're very much at the beginning of a process. I'd estimate, hazard a guess, that we could be talking about Brexit, certainly for the next 4 to 5 years. And of course, the COVID-19 situation hasn't helped matters.
Thanks. Yes, absolutely. And what's the reaction to these developments been like in government?
Well, as you can probably imagine, when we actually secured the agreement and it passed through Parliament and it passed through the member states, there was joy, there was jubilation, there was exhilarance, and whatever you like to call it. It was only on probably the 2nd of January when we saw blockages at ports and we saw delays in the supply chains and we saw supermarket shelves not filled as much as they possibly should be, that the government decided to, or the government thought, hang on a minute, we might have a problem here. And the government has always recognised that there were going to be supply issues. The concern that we have is that those supply issues could actually last far longer than the government and others thought they were going to. And we're looking at least another 2 to 3 months of substantial problems in the supply chain. So when we got the agreement, jubilation, now common sense hopefully is beginning to prevail, and processes and procedures are being adapted. Yeah, absolutely. And big question here, but what do you think will be the overall impact of Brexit on the rural economy? And in particular, I'm thinking of the regions and agriculture in the region. I think, as I said during the presentation, I think we're going to see a major restructuring of the sector. With agriculture, it evolves. It always has done, and it will continue to do so. But we've now got three main factors involved in this restructuring. We have the impact of COVID-19, we have Brexit, and we have the new trade agreement, and we also have the major changes to agricultural policy over the next 7 years. The shape and the picture or the face of agriculture will fundamentally change. This is why I'm saying that that restructuring will lead to the potential loss of 15 to 20% of holdings. Now, it's very possible that those holdings will be bought up by larger holdings, leading to greater economies of scale, which is, from an economic point of view, a good thing. It also, however, may be a case that you have those holdings maintaining their asset, i.e. maintaining or keeping the holding, and then diversifying into something else. Again, it's this whole link between agriculture, the land-based sector, and diversification, which in the future is going to be absolutely crucial as we lead towards recovery from COVID-19. So it's not a quick fix. It will take time, and that restructuring hopefully will lead to a leaner and more resilient agriculture sector throughout the regions, whether you're in the Southwest, Southeast, or wherever in the future.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so let's turn to trade. So the UK's largest trading partner is the EU, which you would expect given our proximity to Europe. Are we shackled to Europe forever, or is there a way we can embrace the principle of global trade?
I think certainly at the beginning of this process, because we are so reliant on the EU as our main trading partner, and you look at particular sectors, you look at the export of lamb, for example, over 90% of lamb which is exported from the UK goes into the EU market. Now, it would be rather silly if we decided, well, we'll forget that market and we'll try and export to the United States or to Australia or even New Zealand, which has more sheep than we do. So we have to do this on a planned basis. We have to realize that future trade agreements with other countries, other third countries, such as the United States or Australia or New Zealand, will take time. We need to be able to actually have those market opportunities in order to be able to export. Without those opportunities, we can have trade agreements left, right, and centre, but if we can't access the market, what's the point? So it's going to be a case that, again, it will take time to develop, and you have to do this on a kind of in a bilateral sense. You maintain your market with your largest trading partner, that being the EU. You then look to extend your trading relationships with other third countries. I think we no longer have a trading empire as we did pre-Second World War. We need to understand that. It's an important point to make, but that doesn't mean to say that in the future, in the next 5, 10 years and ongoing from that we can't build up a major global presence that will actually secure the future of agriculture in Great Britain.
There has been talk from the government recently about a trade deal with Japan. Is that as good as it sounds?
Look, I think the trade deal with Japan was good. One, we finally signed one. Remember that the EU and Japan had a trade deal which was quite significant. The UK's deal with Japan is actually even wider than that. But if you look at the actual volume or value of trade involved, we're only talking about 15 to 20 billion pounds per year. The value of trade with the EU is over 400 billion pounds with between ourselves and the EU. So Japan is a minor player in this. And when you combine all the value of all our trade with third countries outside of the EU, it's close to how we trade with the EU. It's getting there. We need to increase that value. I think the importance of the trade deal with Japan is that it creates a precedent. It says that the UK can negotiate an effective trade deal with a country outside of the EU.
Okay, yeah. And obviously, listening to your explanations, the rules are quite complex. And just to bring in here a question from one of the members to give an example of this, John Pawsey has asked, we import agricultural machinery and parts to service that machinery from Sweden. Other than the GBEORI number, what other administration will we need to have in place?
Well, you certainly, the first thing I would say is for the member to go directly onto the gov.uk website, because all the information is there. As I said during the presentation, any export or any importer needs to go through the set process. If there is just one piece of paper, let's say if we're talking about exports, if the exporter has not got all the documentation which is required, in this case, the Swedish authorities can stop the export of those goods at the Swedish border control posts. And what we're seeing in France in particular, and also in Belgium and Holland now, is that without the necessary documentation, those goods are either being stopped at port or they're going to have to be returned to the UK. And that's where the border operating model comes in. As I tried to explain or show during the presentation, this is an extremely complex process. And I want to repeat this point, because we're out of the single market, the actual rules and regulations relate or feel as if we've actually got no deal, because these are the same rules and regulations we were working on back in October 2019 when we produced the guide to no deal for members, and the rules have barely changed. So that's the importance of that's the importance for members to actually understand how the processes work, certainly understand how goods are transported and what happens in transit in the EU, because those rules and regulations are very, very complex. They make rules of origin look simple. And to make sure that they tick, I hate saying this, but they tick all the boxes of the export and import process as well, because if they don't, those goods will be delayed or they will be rejected. And as we move forward, what we're seeing is that certainly the French customs authorities will begin to open up loads. So what happens is when a load is exported from Britain to, let's say, France, it's usually sealed. What the French customs authorities have intimated is that they will check all lorries and they will break the seals, which they have a legal right to do. Now, we know that the UK government is negotiating with the French customs authorities to avoid that happening. But if we get to that situation, all that happens is we have delay. And if we have delay in the supply chains and delay in trade flows, it increases costs throughout the supply chain. And those costs will be borne ultimately by producers. Okay.
It's certainly not straightforward. And actually, as you say, it is quite complex. And aside from looking at gov.uk, what's the CLA doing to help guide members through this at the moment, and perhaps sharing more information?
Yeah, we produced two main documents, which hopefully we can get onto the screen, because I just want to very briefly show everybody what we've actually set out in those documents. And here we go. And hopefully this time I'll actually be able to do it properly. So what we're looking at here, and if I can take control of the screen, asking Sarah very nicely. There we go. So hopefully I should have control. Yeah. So if I can I'm going to show everybody what we've got here. So this is a section in what we call getting businesses Brexit ready, and it relates to protected food names which are protected designations of origin, and the UK will have its own system as well as there being an EU system. So what we've done is we've set these out in a series of questions and we sought to answer them. Now it's quite extensive, and we've tried to think of all the questions that would need to be answered, and what the new rules and regulations will be. But again, it illustrates that members will need to actually go through the processes, understand what the new rules are, and make sure that they are covered for those new rules. And as we see, what will the UK scheme look like? We go through that. We look at what the new logos will look like in a minute. Well, here we go. So UK will have new logos, and these are set out in the document there. So we have designation origin for UK protected, geographic origin, and traditional speciality. So it's very similar to the EU system, but it's a UK system, and there are the UK subtle changes to the system. If I take you, if I can do this quickly, take you all the way back to the beginning of the document. There we go. So it's Brexit, getting rural business ready. Let's just take you through the table of contents, and you'll see the range of issues that we've tried to cover. So you can see there under section 5, the briefing notes, we've gone through the export and import processes for all the major sectors. We've looked at organic trade. Again, this document, as I said before, will be updated as new rules come into play. For example, with organic trade, we now know that the EU will agree with UK organic trade until December 2023, when it was originally in the document 2021. So some progress has been made, but again, it illustrates that the rules will change. Importantly, we've got a section there on food labelling, but one issue I think members also really do need to be aware of is that on haulage and transit. And again, re-emphasizing the point that it's vital that if you export goods, you must have the correct paperwork, and it's going to be very, very important that hauliers go through the right processes to make sure that they've got the right documentation, because they're the ones who are going to be stopped at border control posts in the EU. So the document illustrates all the areas that we're talking about in detail, but as I said, it will be updated. And if I can ask Sarah to bring up the other document, and if she takes control, that's it, takes control of the screen. We've got a second document, which is what we call frequently asked questions. And what we've done here is to actually set out what we believe would be the questions you're going to, members will ask. So question 13, for example, how do I import plants and plant products from the EU after the 31st of December? Again, it gives a straightforward, simple answer. But again, it takes the member back to the CLA Brexit hub, because as I said at the beginning, all the information that members will need is set out in the hub. If I go down to another one, let's have a look at horticulture. No. Again, that's what we're talking about, organic produce earlier. There's an answer there. Again, will I be able to source seasonal labour from the EU? Again, that needs to be increased because, of course, the government's agreed to 30,000 visas. Stress the point there's only for 1 year. But again, it goes through details such as what the rules are relating to the impact of changes to immigration policy for businesses in the UK, and what businesses might be able to do to mitigate the impact of shortages of labour and where they potentially could get domestic labour from. It's additional information for the members, but it's in a very clear and straightforward way. What we try to do is make it as straightforward as we possibly can for the members. So these two documents, the Getting Business Ready after Brexit and the frequently asked questions, are all available on the CLA Brexit Hub, and we would strongly advise members to look at those documents, as well as, and in addition to, the technical information which is available on the gov.uk website. Because one of the reasons why we did this was because when we were going through all the documentation on the gov.uk website, it was extremely complex, and what we tried to do is simplify it as much as we possibly can, but make sure that all the relevant information is set out in an easily accessible manner. So Sarah would like to take control again.
I think that's a really good point, that the information is there, but also to contact your regional officers as well if there's any specific points that you just can't pull out of the document that you want to know about. So yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah, you know, we anticipate there will be, we know there will be teething issues, there will be problems in terms of implementation of the agreement itself. It's important, as far as we're concerned, that members have as much information as possible available to them. But if they've got particular questions, what they need to do is contact the CLA region. If the CLA region can't answer it, then obviously the CLA region gets hold of me, and I'll answer it for them, as I had yesterday. But you know, what we're here is to give the right advice and the right information to the membership so that they can make sure that their businesses are as ready as possible. Yeah, absolutely. I just want to turn to a question from a member that's come in. It's David Fahy, and it's farmers are primary producers. We sell 100% of our grain and pulses to traders, and some of our products will perhaps be exported by them. What certification of origin will be required of us to cover all possible destinations for our product? Right, you're going to need what's called a certificate of origin as well as a statement of origin. So the rules that relate or that have been in place for the export of arable grain, for example, in this instance to third countries such as North Africa, the Middle East and elsewhere, remain in force. And I was in a meeting on Monday where this issue actually came up, where there are problems that exporters are not actually holding the right documentation. So when the shipment gets to Genoa, for example, it's held in port, and the ship is held in port for at least 2 weeks because they're struggling, or the exporter is struggling to find the right documentation. So it's absolutely vital that the trader, the exporter, has the right documentation before the shipment leaves UK territorial waters. And it's the same process in terms of certificate of origin and statement of origin, which will be needed, along with the other documentation in terms of the inventory, which has already been required in the past. So no real changes, but greater clarification than we've had in the past. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And we haven't talked much about labour in your presentation, and this year was a classic example of why we need a migrant workforce with labour shortages caused by the pandemic. Is 2021 going to be a repeat of this, or has the government's immigration policy got this just about right? I wouldn't say that the government immigration policy has got this right at all. As I said during the presentation, this is a political decision, not an economic one, because if I was in government from a purely economic point of view, I would never have introduced this in the first place, because all you're doing is a shortage of labour leads to reduced output, and therefore leads to reduced amount of money you receive. So it makes no economic sense. What we're going to see this year is a repeat of what we saw last year, but we won't have the domestic labour force, because as we come out of the pandemic, we won't have the furlough scheme. So those workers who were furloughed will be employed and won't be able to work on farm. That's the first thing. The second thing is, If you seek to use the unemployed, and we know that unemployment could reach 2.5, 3 million by the end of March this year, it's possible. But again, you've got to train them. You've got to train these people to actually do the job. One of the great things with migrant workers, particularly in the soft fruit sector, is that they were very, very good at what they did. They were very fast and they were very efficient at picking, in this case, soft fruit. And again, we're talking about efficiencies being made. What we found over last year with the labour problems because of COVID, we had training problem or training skills issue. We also had domestic workers didn't actually stay on the job very long. You were lucky if they were there for a month, 2 months. We know of a number of examples where they left after 2 or 3 days because they simply weren't able to do the job. That's why we say the government's decision to extend visas to 30,000 migrant workers obviously is welcome. But if we're going to make this work in the future, then one, that quota has to be increased, or agriculture becomes what's called a shortage occupation, i.e. there's a shortage of labour and there's greater flexibility within the immigration system. Also, you've got to remember, we're not just talking about agriculture here, we're talking about the processing sector, we're talking about the tourism sector, we're talking about other areas of the rural economy, which all have tended to rely on migrant workers, primarily from the EU, for the last decade or so. The UK's immigration policy, by restricting it under the points-based system, is, from a purely economics point of view, negative, to say the least. Would that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think it's watch this space, but yes, it's going to be another challenging year from the sounds of it. Now, look, we have just run over time, but I have to ask you about transition, and I'm sure the members would like to hear about that too. Later this year, we're going to see major changes coming through with the reductions in direct payments and a major policy shift. And you raised in your presentation about the issue of a triple whammy. What do you think the effect and consequences will be?
I think, as I said, and this goes back to the point about restructuring. When we were looking at Brexit, probably about 3 years ago, we recognised, because we modelled the effects, that Brexit would lead to a faster restructuring of the agricultural sector. And we've seen that over the last couple of years. We still hold to that view. However, the major changes in agricultural policy and the transition away from direct payments to environmental or public goods is going to speed up that process even more. So, you know, in a sense, what the 15 to 20% reduction in number of holdings that I suggested over a 5-year period earlier, that may be more. And it may be the case that it will lead to large farms getting larger, where the need for contract farming will become even more important than it is. It could lead to far greater rationalisation of agriculture, in the sense that particular regions of the country will be known for one agricultural output only, so it won't be mixed. You could see, say, for example, South West focusing purely on dairy, but from the positive point of view, certainly from, if you look at the economic models that we've studied, what it will do, it will lead to greater opportunities in terms of widening the base of both agriculture, but also the rural economy. And if you widen the base, you extend the portfolio or extend the issues which may be negative. So the actual impact is reduced. And what we would certainly say to members is that you will have these factors, and they will be major, but there will be opportunities in terms of diversification. I think what's important, as far as we're concerned, certainly from a policy point of view, is that we push government to actually have an explicit diversification policy, which it had at the beginning of the 2000s with when we had the Labour government introducing the Rural White Paper, that explicitly set out a clear diversification policy, and it worked. So why not try and replicate the the positives of that for the future? Because we recognise that the changes to agricultural policy through transition will be significant. The government hopes it will lead to a leaner, a more efficient agricultural base. We would hope that would be the case as well. But we know that there will be bumps along the road, so to speak, and it's important that members are fully aware of what those bumps will be and how to mitigate what the potential negative impacts could be in the next 7 to 10 years.
Absolutely. Okay. And just finally, just a quick comment on what you think will be Brexit's legacy.
There will be a legacy. It depends on which government. Well, you've got the Conservative government under Boris Johnson at the moment. They brought us. They did what they said they were going to do. They were going to get Brexit done, which they have done. So they've met their manifesto commitment. I think it could be the case that over the next 4 or 5 years, people may see that there were actual advantages in staying in the EU. I don't think, however, in my lifetime, the UK will ever rejoin the European Union. I think we've now gone past that point, and we need to realise that, and we need to start again, so to speak. I think, however, given the fact we're looking at a completely new UK trade policy, this is a time when we could have a major effect, not just on trade, but on foreign policy as well. And I think if the government and if the officials involved are able to set out a clear and effective trade policy, that could be used, that could be a major foreign policy instrument in our relations with countries in the future. So there is a positive legacy out of Brexit.
Okay, very interesting. Charles, I'm going to leave it there. We've just run over time, but it's been absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure on behalf of all the members, we are very lucky to have you on our staff to work through this and COVID and everything else that's been going on with rural economy at the moment. So, so thank you very much. Just waiting for the slides to be shared again. Basically, thank you to all of you for staying with us. I hope it's been of interest. Please look at the CLA website at the Brexit information. Do contact your regional offices if you need any more information. Equally, Charles is always there at the end of the phone if you'd like to speak to him directly. Coming up, we've also got a briefing on COVID and also some other interesting webinars. Of course, our Rural Powerhouse Week, which was last in November. Do look back, everything is on the website, so do have a look at that. Thank you very much, and take care, and we hope to see you again very soon.